The voice of the Catherian cadet, a low rumble of arrogance, cut through the noise of the Galactic Defense Academy's mess hall. "I have chosen my opponent for the public sparring exhibition," Zorax announced, his gaze fixed on the solitary figure at a corner table. He gestured with a clawed hand. "The primitive from the Sol system. It will be a short but educational bout." A wave of murmurs, mostly of amusement, swept through the alien cadets. Zorax had no way of knowing he had just challenged a man who had survived the glassed-out battlefields of the Outer Rim Wars. A man for whom a padded sparring mat was a luxury he had not seen in years. The Galactic Defense Academy was the crucible of the unified galaxies, a place where the children of 1,000 different species were forged into the next generation of officers and soldiers. It was a nexus of power and tradition, and of prejudice. No species held their traditions more dearly or their prejudices more proudly than the Catherians. They were a people born from a world of high gravity and lethal predators, and their culture valued strength and martial honor above all else. To them, most other races were soft, unworthy of respect. Cadet Zorax was the very model of this exceptionalism. He stood a full head taller than most, his chitinous plates gleaming under the academy lights. He was strong, fast, and at the top of every physical metric. He saw the academy not as a place of learning, but as a stage to demonstrate his greatness. And in his eyes, there was no creature more pathetic, more undeserving of its place in these halls than the human. That human was Jake Morrison. Where Zorax was a vibrant predator, Jake was quiet. He was the Academy's sole human representative, a last-minute addition after his predecessor had washed out. He kept to himself, his head often buried in a data pad. His physical scores were average, and his presence so unassuming he might as well have been a ghost. To Zorax, Jake was the perfect symbol of humanity's mediocrity, a species that had stumbled into space through luck, not strength. What the Academy records failed to mention, what no one bothered to look up, was where Jake Morrison had been for the last 10 years. He wasn't a fresh recruit from Earth. He was a combat veteran of the brutal Outer Rim Wars, a grinding conflict the core worlds preferred to forget. He had fought in knee-deep mud against horrors the Academy's simulations could not replicate. He wasn't quiet because he was timid. He was quiet because in a war zone, noise gets you killed. He was not average. He was economical. His calm was not that of a peaceful soul, but the coiled stillness of a man who had stared into the abyss and made it blink first. The provocations had been escalating for weeks. It began with subtle slights, Zorax cutting in front of Jake in cues, or accidentally knocking a tray from his hands. He would make loud pronouncements in class about the fragility of species with endoskeletons, his eyes always finding the human. Jake never rose to the bait. He would simply clean the mess, step aside, or continue reading, his expression unreadable. To Zorax, this was undeniable proof of cowardice. Each non-reaction fueled the Catherian's arrogance, convincing him that a public lesson was not just deserved, but required. The official challenge in the mess hall was the culmination of this feud. Academy regulations stated that any formal challenge laid down in public had to be accepted. It was an old rule. Zorax had cornered his prey. As the mess hall hung on the silence, Jake finally looked up. His eyes, a pale blue, met Zorax's. There was no fear in them, no anger, just a flat, weary assessment. It was a look that unnerved the Catherian for a fraction of a second, before his pride reasserted itself. "Fine," Jake said, his voice even. Then he went back to eating. The simplicity of it was almost an anticlimax. The news spread like wildfire. The betting pools were laughably one-sided. It was not a matter of who would win, but how many seconds it would take. Yet a few, the older, instructors and a handful of more perceptive cadets, felt a prickle of unease. They had seen Jake in the simulators. He never went for high scores. He just won. Every time. His methods were always efficient, brutal, and completely devoid of the flair the Academy prized. They saw his unnerving calm for what it was. Not weakness, but a terrifying reservoir of something they could not name. The combat arena was packed. The low hum of the protective energy field enclosed the raised sparring mat. A sterile white square under the glare of the lights. The air was thick with anticipation. Zorax made his entrance as if he were a champion. He raised his arms, soaking in the cheers. He performed a series of ceremonial warm-up katas, each movement sharp and powerful. A display of raw dominance meant to intimidate. Then, Jake Morrison walked out. He wore the standard gray training fatigues and moved with a simple, deliberate pace. He did not look at the crowd. He walked to his side of the mat, did a few simple stretches, and waited. It was the contrast between an actor taking the stage and a professional arriving to do a job. The starting bell chimed. Zorax exploded into motion. He launched himself across the mat with a ferocity that had won him dozens of matches. It was a textbook Catherian assault, a blur of powerful strikes aimed to overwhelm an opponent's guard in seconds, and it did nothing. Jake moved just enough. A slight sidestep here, a tilted shoulder there. He didn't block the blows, he redirected them. Zorax's powerful punches slid harmlessly off his forearms. His kicks met only empty air. It was like trying to punch water. Jake's feet barely seemed to move. Yet he was never where Zorax expected him to be. He wasn't fighting back. He wasn't even defending in a way they recognized. He was simply avoiding, diagnosing. The crowd's confident roars faltered, replaced by confused murmurs. Zorax, growing frustrated, abandoned his technique and swung wildly, his pride turning to rage. Jake's eyes, which had been passive, sharpened. The analysis was over. As Zorax lunged forward in a final bellowing charge, Jake moved. He flowed forward inside the Catherian's reach. In a single fluid motion too fast for the eye to track, he hooked a leg behind Zorax's, twisted his torso, and used the alien's own momentum against him. Zorax, for the first time in his life, found himself completely airborne. He crashed onto the mat with a thud that knocked the wind out of his thoracic spiracles. Before he could process the shock, Jake was on him. Not with fists, but with the cold pressure of perfect leverage. A knee pinned one arm, an elbow locked the other. He was immobilized. The fight was over. The crowd was stunned into absolute silence, but Jake wasn't finished. This was about a lesson. He leaned down, his face close to the defeated cadets. And then he did something that made every Catherian in the audience gasp in horror. He reached out and placed his open palm gently on Zorax's mandibles, forcing the proud warrior's head to turn until their eyes met. In Catherian culture, this was the ultimate gesture of dominance, an insult so profound it was usually answered only with a challenge to the death. Zorax's eyes widened in shock, which morphed into a wave of soul-crushing humiliation. He could not move. He was completely at the human's mercy. A choked sob escaped him, and he frantically tapped his free hand on the mat. "Surrender!" Jake stood up. He did not gloat. He did not look at the trembling figure on the mat. He gave a slight nod to the stunned referee, turned, and walked out of the arena with the same quiet, methodical pace he had entered with. He left a gaping silence in his wake, filled with the shattered preconceptions of hundreds of alien cadets. They had not witnessed a sparring match. They had witnessed an execution. The quiet human was not a cadet. He was a veteran, a true predator who had just reminded a pampered bully what a real threat looked like. In the aftermath, the fallout was immediate. The other cadets no longer saw Jake as a peculiarity. They saw him with a newfound awe, tinged with a healthy dose of fear. His corner of the mess hall remained empty, but now it was out of respect, not disdain. They had mistaken restraint for inability. They would not make that mistake again. For Zorax, the humiliation was only just beginning. Stripped of his titles, he was assigned the most menial duties. But the worst part was the tradition he himself had supported. He was forced to stand before the entire student body and give a public recitation of his failure, explaining in detail how the human had defeated him. He had to admit that his strength was nothing against the human's skill, his pride nothing against the human's experience. It was a cultural and psychological evisceration. Far more painful than any physical blow. What do you think of Jake's response? Was it the perfect lesson for an arrogant cadet, or was the cultural insult a step too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing for more stories from across the galaxy. The incident at the Galactic Defense Academy became a quiet legend, a cautionary tale told to new arrivals. It was a story about the vast, dangerous difference between a warrior trained for a ring and a survivor forged in the fires of war. While some train for glory on a padded mat, others have already learned the brutal calculus of survival in the dirt, and that is a lesson they carry with them, silently, forever.